Back in the 1990s, an Indiana family fled their own home, terrified, as a host of strange paranormal activity plagued them. Furniture crashed across rooms, beds lifted violently off the floor, and windows shattered with a deafening roar. Seemingly classic poltergeist activity. Their children were terrified, pointing out shadows that seemed to move on their own. No intruders, and no explanations. Maybe you saw their story on a number of paranormal-based TV shows, but then their stories seemed to fall through the cracks of the public consciousness. Was this actually a haunting, or something much more complicated? A living person triggering supernatural forces in the physical realm? Whatever it was, it turned an ambitious idea into a living nightmare. And it was just getting started. Madison, Indiana is one of the oldest towns in the state. Founded in the early 19th century along the Ohio River, the town became known for its historic architecture and quiet neighborhoods. By the 1980s, much of the region was rural and sparsely populated. Roadside motels, built during the highway boom of the mid-20th century, dotted the landscape. Many had been abandoned as interstate travel replaced smaller highways. One such building was the property the Johnson family purchased. The motel had fallen into disrepair and had reportedly sat vacant for years. To Ron Johnson, the property represented opportunity. He saw potential in the large building, plenty of space for the family, and enough room to develop a small business. Doretta Johnson also had hopes for the house. She wanted a stable environment for her children and a place where the family could start fresh. But Doretta carried with her a deeply troubled past. According to later interviews and her memoir, she had endured a traumatic childhood marked by severe abuse and instability. That personal history would later become central to the interpretation of the haunting, because some investigators would eventually suggest that the disturbances in the house were not caused by ghosts at all, but by Doretta herself. The Johnson family moved into the building and immediately began renovations. They painted walls, installed windows, and started converting motel rooms into living spaces. But strange problems appeared almost immediately. Paint would not stay on the walls. Wallpaper peeled off overnight. Electrical appliances malfunctioned without explanation. Then the noises began. Doretta reported hearing footsteps and movement in the attic late at night. At first, she assumed animals had gotten into the building, but repeated searches found nothing. Soon the disturbances spread through the house. Doors opened and closed, and objects shifted from where they had been placed. And the family began experiencing a growing sense of unease. One of the earliest frightening incidents involved their young daughter. The child claimed that someone, or something, was trying to hurt her doll. At first, the family assumed it was simply a child's imagination. But then the physical disturbances began. Furniture moved, beds shook, and loud banging sounds echoed through the walls. The family then began to suspect that the house itself might be haunted. Over the following weeks, the disturbances intensified dramatically. Objects were reportedly thrown across rooms. Loud crashing sounds came from empty areas of the building. At times, the activity seemed to focus specifically on Doretta Johnson. She reported being pushed or struck by unseen forces. Strange fires started spontaneously in the house. Electrical devices turned on and off by themselves. Even more disturbing was the emotional effect the house seemed to have on the family. Arguments erupted suddenly between family members. Tension filled the house. The atmosphere felt oppressive. At times, the disturbances became violent enough that the family fled the building temporarily to stay with relatives. But the strange activity, according to Doretta, sometimes followed them, which raised an unsettling possibility. What if the phenomenon wasn't tied to the house? What if it was attached to a person? Doretta also reported experiencing vivid and deeply disturbing visions inside the house. On one occasion, while entering the bathroom, she claimed to see the image of a woman lying motionless in the bathtub, partially submerged in water. According to her later account, the vision intensified into a horrifying scene in which a man appeared to be drowning the woman while a small child stood nearby. Whether this was a hallucination, a psychic impression, or something else entirely was never determined. But the experience left Doretta shaken and increasingly fearful of the house. Other events seemed to center around the children's toys. One evening, the family heard a small doll in their daughter's room repeating the words, "Mama, Mama, Mama." At first, they assumed the toy had simply been activated accidentally. But when they removed the batteries, the voice reportedly continued. The doll repeated the same words several more times before finally going silent, leaving the family unnerved and uncertain of what they had just witnessed. Strange occurrences were also reported in their daughter's bedroom. On several mornings, Doretta claimed she discovered small bows tied neatly around objects in the room, wrapped around furniture legs, toys, and other items that had been untouched the night before. No one in the household admitted to tying them, and the careful knots appeared in places where the children insisted they had not been playing. The Johnson family also reported seeing apparitions inside the building. Their daughter described encountering the figure of a young girl moving through the house, sometimes standing quietly in doorways or appearing briefly at the end of hallways. Doretta herself claimed to see the shape of a man with a disturbing grin watching from the shadows. These sightings were fleeting and unpredictable, but they added to the growing sense that the house was occupied by something unseen. On more than one occasion, Doretta said voices seemed to come through the radio speakers, faintly repeating what sounded like cries for help. Even the family's car was not immune to the disturbances. Its radio reportedly turned on and off without explanation while parked outside the home. Perhaps one of the most frightening incidents involved the Johnsons' young daughter while she slept. According to Doretta's account, the child awoke in terror one night, claiming that a snake was wrapped around her throat. The girl insisted the creature was choking her, yet when the parents rushed into the room, nothing was visible. Despite this, the child struggled and gasped for air as if something were physically restraining her. Moments later, the sensation abruptly stopped, leaving the family shaken and unable to explain what had happened. Taken together, these incidents created an atmosphere of constant fear inside the Johnson home. The disturbances seemed unpredictable, sometimes subtle and other times terrifyingly intense. For the family living inside the abandoned motel, the line between imagination, psychological stress, and something potentially paranormal began to blur in ways they could no longer easily dismiss. One of the most dramatic nights occurred during a violent episode of poltergeist activity. According to the family's account, the disturbances began with loud banging sounds in the walls. Moments later, furniture began sliding across the floor, and the children's beds shook violently. Glass shattered. Then a strange blue light appeared in the hallway. The activity escalated rapidly. Objects were thrown. Windows broke outward. The family fled the house in panic and stood outside watching as the disturbance continued inside. That night convinced them that whatever was happening had become dangerous. The Johnsons began searching for help, and the case soon attracted investigators interested in studying paranormal phenomena. Over time, multiple investigators became involved in the Johnson case. Psychics were consulted. Religious figures were contacted in hopes of blessing the house. But one of the most significant figures to examine the case was American's parapsychologist William G. Roll. Roll was a well-known researcher in the study of poltergeist phenomena. His work often focused on cases where unexplained disturbances seemed connected to a specific individual. After examining the Johnson case, Roll proposed a controversial explanation. He believed the disturbances were not caused by spirits or ghosts. Instead, he suggested they might be a form of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, often abbreviated as RSPK. In simple terms, this theory proposes that intense emotional stress can unconsciously produce physical effects in the environment. In many poltergeist cases, researchers have noted that the disturbances often center around a particular person experiencing psychological trauma. In the Johnson case, Roll believed that person might be Doretta. Given her history of childhood abuse and emotional distress, Roll suggested the disturbances could represent a form of psychic energy being unconsciously projected into the environment. Rather than a haunting, the house might have been experiencing a psychological storm. As the story spread, the Johnson haunting began attracting media attention. The case appeared on paranormal television programs and documentaries. One of the earliest dramatizations appeared on the television special Haunted Lives, True Ghost Stories, which featured a segment based on the Johnson family's experiences. Years later, the story resurfaced in the paranormal television series Paranormal Witness, which recreated the events surrounding the haunting of the abandoned motel. The case also gained attention through Doretta Johnson's memoir. In 1995, she published a book titled The People in the Attic, The Haunting of Doretta Johnson, detailing her experiences inside the house. The book described the disturbances in vivid detail: the unexplained fires, violent poltergeist activity, and the emotional toll the haunting had on her family. For paranormal enthusiasts, the Johnson case quickly became a fascinating example of a modern haunting. But for skeptics and scientists, it raised an entirely different set of questions. As with many famous paranormal cases, the Johnson haunting has been the subject of skepticism. Critics have proposed several alternative explanations. One theory suggests that the disturbances could have been exaggerated or misinterpreted. Living in a large, deteriorating building like an abandoned motel could easily produce strange sounds and structural problems. Other skeptics point to psychological factors: high stress, family conflict, and the emotional strain of renovation projects can create environments where ordinary events appear supernatural. And then there is the theory proposed by William Roll. If the disturbances were indeed real, they might have been generated by unconscious psychokinetic activity rather than spirits. This interpretation places the Johnsons' case within a category of poltergeist events that researchers believe may be linked to human psychology rather than the supernatural. But even this explanation raises a profound mystery. If human emotion can produce physical disturbances in the environment, what exactly is the mechanism behind it? Eventually, the Johnson family left the property. The disturbances, according to their account, gradually subsided, but the experience left a lasting impact on their lives. Doretta later spoke publicly about the case and wrote about her experiences in that memoir. The house itself faded from public attention. Unlike some famous haunted houses, it didn't become a tourist attraction. Instead, the story survived mainly through paranormal documentaries, books, and discussions among researchers. For many investigators, the Johnson haunting remains one of the most intriguing modern poltergeist cases because of the involvement of a major parapsychologist and the possibility that the events may have been psychologically generated. Today, decades after the events in that abandoned Indiana motel, the Johnson haunting remains unresolved. If the family's experiences were accurate, then something extraordinary happened inside that building. Objects moved, windows shattered, fires ignited without explanation. But what caused it? Was the property truly haunted? Was an unseen force tormenting the family? Or was the phenomenon emerging from the mind of someone living inside the house? The Johnson case sits at the uneasy intersection of psychology and the paranormal, a place where trauma, belief, and unexplained events collide. Over 30 years have passed since the Johnson family fled that house. Now it's assumed the disturbances stopped the moment they left, but it is fair to wonder if it went with them and was never tied to the property at all. Was this classic poltergeist phenomena, or a manifestation of something much deeper, a mind capable of influencing the physical surroundings in a way that science has only begun to explain? Evidence points to stress, trauma, and psychology, but witnesses swore the events were terrifyingly real and often inescapable. So the Johnson case remains one of the most unsettling modern paranormal stories in America. Perhaps the greatest mystery is this: do the dead walk among us? Or do the most powerful forces of all, the ones we can't see, actually live within us? If you enjoy deep dives into paranormal cases, subscribe here for more true stories of hauntings, the supernatural, and unexplained phenomena. And in the meantime, remember, stay spooky.